And hello, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live on a Wednesday night. Another special report tonight. We're going to be taking a look at the mole inside the FBI. Charles McGonagall, what exactly was he up to in the last 25 years while he was at the FBI? We're subtitling this, How Putin Got His Inside Man. Plus, we'll have all the news on Marjorie Taylor Greene, George Santos, and all the latest from Ukraine coming up. And I'm also thrilled to announce that our very special friend, Craig Unger, the author of American Compromise, is here. Hi, Craig. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks. Good to see you, Zev.
Likewise, it's been a while. I'm excited to have you here because you have probably the greatest insight of anybody into the last, maybe 3 or 4 decades, maybe even longer, of the workings of the mob inside inside New York and inside the United States, and particularly as it involves Donald Trump and some of the people that the former counterintelligence head of the New York office would have been investigating. So I'm excited to hear your take about what might not have been investigated if Russians did in fact have a mole inside the FBI. Do you think he was as much that as I'm saying he is? Do you think this was just a chance, a real long-time mole that they've had in there?
Well, it's quite possible, and you have to wonder whether or not McGonagall was responsible for the leaks in the weeks just before the election. He was hired, I believe, on October 4th to that position in 2016, just about exactly a month before the election. And there were a fair number of leaks there that forced James Comey's hands, and he made that announcement 8 days before the election that they were back investigating Hillary. So it's quite possible McGonagall was involved. I don't know. But it also raises a larger question. There's so many things about which one Trump should have been investigated, and you have to wonder, why didn't the FBI go there?
You have to wonder why. And there's a long list of investigations that McGonagall was involved in, and we'll go through them tonight, which didn't ever reach sort of a satisfactory conclusion. You know, some of them, like TWA 800, we just don't know what happened. In other cases, you had people wrongly accused, but we never found out what really was the main cause of these crimes or the criminals involved in these crimes. So we'll go through all of that. Plus, I've been able to find out a lot about what McGonagall was involved with in Albania. And let me tell you, it's unseemly stuff. It all goes back to Vladimir Putin and Oleg Deripaska, two names we know quite well. And we'll cover all of that as we go through the hour. But I should get everyone caught up on the news, so let's do that first, beginning with some news out of Ukraine. And topping the news tonight, the United States will be sending its Abrams M1 tanks to Ukraine, and Germany says it will approve sending its Leopard tanks. Joe Biden made the announcement today at the White House.
The United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, the equivalent of 1 Ukrainian battalion. Secretary Austin has recommended this step because it will enhance the Ukraine's capacity to defend its territory and achieve its strategic objectives.
What that really means is the balance of power is really going to shift on the Ukrainian battlefield, because Russia really does not have the firepower to fight against these kinds of tanks with the armor that these tanks have. In other news, it's hard to believe, but apparently Marjorie Taylor Greene believes she can be the vice president to another Trump presidency. Here's what NBC reported this morning.
Vice President Marjorie Taylor Greene, according to NBC News exclusive, reporting the controversial Georgia Congresswoman is setting her sights on just that, a presidential ticket, hoping to team up with former President Donald Trump as his VP in 2024. Former Trump aide Steve Bannon, who spoke to Greene about the job, told NBC News she, quote, sees herself on the short list.
Of course, we're a long way away from him actually making a short list and vetting candidates. He obviously really likes Marjorie Taylor Greene. She is somebody who has immense ambition, as Steve Bannon said to me. He paraphrased an old Washington song saying every time she looks in the mirror, she sees a president staring back at her. The vice presidency might be the fastest route to do that.
Meanwhile, a lawyer for the former vice president, Mike Pence, says classified documents, were discovered at the Indiana home of the former vice president, and a small number of them have now been returned to the National Archives. It's unclear if he'll be getting his own special counsel. And in other news, after our reporting last week about the financial worries around George Santos's campaign financing, it seems that he's amended some of his campaign financing reports that we said might be illegal last week. Now he says that it was not a personal loan that he funded his campaign with, but rather money that came from somewhere else. Now, where did it come from? He doesn't say, although we did outline last week in our reporting, which seems to have got a lot of people's attention, that the financing did come from unusual characters who are funding his campaign. That is the news. Coming up, another big story that the mainstream news, has neglected to follow up on. We're not going to do the same thing tonight. Inside the FBI, was there a mole for the Russians? Hey, it's Zev from Narrative. I'm excited to announce the launch of my new original series, Spy Murdoch. This is an epic story of Rupert Murdoch as an intelligence asset, and it's all 100% true. Spy Murdoch will premiere in February on Narrative's Patreon feed and Narrative's new premium YouTube channel. Now, to join either of those services, you can either head over to patreon.com/narrative and sign up there, or to join our new YouTube premium channel, just look for the join button underneath the screen when you're watching on YouTube. This is brand new content with bombshell revelations that have never been revealed before about the iconic Murdoch. We will explain, amongst many other things, how Fox News gained such a foothold in the United States. For a limited time, we're offering access to all our premium content for just $5 a month. Prices will go up, so lock in today. You'll have a front row seat as I unravel the secrets of Rupert Murdoch for the first time. Don't miss this opportunity to be among the first to learn these brand new details and watch this Narrative original series with me. It'll change the way you view history and your place in it. That's Spy Murdoch, beginning in February on Narrative. Back live now with Craig Unger, the author of American Compromise. Craig, take us back to that moment, because that was a good place to start, maybe, with James Comey, who had, the FBI director in September, or was it October in 2016, had to hire somebody new for that office in New York and for the field office job of the counterintelligence agent in charge. He chose Charles McGonagall, who by all accounts is a controversial choice now that we know that he's been indicted on the indictments that he's been charged with. But remind us of that period of time. Tell us a little bit more, if you can, about what Comey was doing with those investigations, with the Wiener emails, with the Wiener laptop, and what happened around that. So it's such an important part of the story here.
Right. Well, we're getting down to the last 4 weeks before the presidential election, and there was a lot of internal stuff going on within the FBI. I don't think nearly enough attention's been paid to that. To me, there was pretty clearly a Rudy Giuliani wing of the FBI. And now we see Rudy, of course, as a cartoon character. And I mean, he looks ridiculous with his dyed hair dripping down his face, and he's been completely discredited. Back then, he wasn't, not so much. He was still a bit of the America's a mayor attached to him. I think the position McGonagall got of counterintelligence is extremely important. And one of the big flaws the FBI has made, and Robert Mueller and the Mueller probe as well, is that these investigations were treated as criminal rather than counterintelligence. And when you're dealing with people like Oleg Deripaska, it's really got to be counterintelligence. National security should be the first priority, not the last. And it also raises questions about how they were treating Donald Trump, too, because as I reported in my previous book, House of Trump, House of Putin, the Russian mafia had been laundering millions and millions of dollars through Trump real estate. And that all went by the wayside. Forgot about it. No one was ever prosecuted on it. And it wasn't even raised much by the mainstream media at all, not to mention the FBI.
Sorry, go ahead. Go on. No, it's an interesting time. You point out, the time that Charles McGonagall spent in the FBI really tracks the whole emergence of the Russian mob in the New York and also the United States. I mean, we had the Cosa Nostra there before that, and then the Russian mob sort of came in with the refuseniks, maybe amongst them, and as that was happening, we sort of saw a new kind of mob, and then with that mob emerging, there was new leadership in the in the FBI and in New York City. And that leadership was essentially Rudy Giuliani. I mean, he was the guy in charge, at least in the mayor's office, but before that at the attorney general's office, for policing this change that happened from the Cosa Nostra into the more Russian controlled New York's mob scene. So that was a really interesting time. And in that office that he had a very good collaborator, because James Kallstrom was the head of the New York City FBI field office. And we know that Kallstrom and Rudy had a long history of working together, even after they both left their respective offices. They worked as part of a consultancy together. They sort of traveled the world providing services to different people. And they also always kept an open ear to what was going on in the FBI field office by being involved in the FBI union, which is where they were able to get a lot of influence and get a lot of information. So, and of course, at the same time as all this was happening, Louis Freeh, another close collaborator of Rudy Giuliani, was the FBI director. So you really had the three very important positions, especially in New York City, that really had a way of controlling who was going to be the top crime guy, who was going to be the bottom crime guy. And it seems that Charles McGonagall, way back in 1996, began his career as an officer in that mob world, really looking at Russian counterintelligence in New York City. So, a long time that he must be familiar with a lot of the same players who are still there today.
Right, and Kallstrom was very close to Trump as well. I've seen outtakes from of him on video explaining his relationship with Trump. I quote him in my last book, American Compromise, and he said that Trump gave Trump, who was famously cheap about giving to charities back in the 70s, he gave $1.3 million to Kallstrom's favorite charity. Kallstrom said Trump would call him at least once a week for a 40-year period. I mean, that's a real friendship. I don't know how many friends you speak to every single week for 40 years.
Not that many, actually.
And no one was cracking down on this. I mean, when I first got into investigating the money laundering going through Trump Tower of the Russian mafia money, to be honest, I got FBI files, and I think if I can get FBI files, the FBI should have been able to get them too. I think they did nothing with this.
So this was when did the mob infiltration and Trump sort of coincide? What years are we talking about here?
Well, I go back all the way back to the 1980s. And in 1984, a guy named David Bogadin was a Russian mobster, and I mean, according to FBI files, and he went to Trump Towers. Trump Tower just opened the previous year, so it was this glamorous, glitzy new building. And Bogadin was a mobster. He personally met with Trump. He had, I believe it was $6 million in cash. And he said, I'll take 5 condos.
Wow.
And,
back then, a lot of money back then in the 1980s.
That's like 15 million today or so.
Yeah.
And Trump, of course, part of the problem is it's very hard to prosecute money laundering because you have to prove that Trump, the recipient, knew it came from illicit sources. But Trump, of course, doesn't ask questions. He doesn't say, oh, where did you get that money? Was it from your prostitution ring? No, he just takes the money and doesn't ask questions. And this kind of thing happened with 1,300 condos that Trump sold under conditions that count for money laundering. That is, to an anonymous owner of a limited liability corporation, and all cash purchases without any bank financing whatsoever. That's 1,300 condos, and it's rare for a Trump condo to go for under $1 million.
So by 1996, I mean, there must have been, do you know how many towers he'd built by 1996? I don't want to put you on the spot on that one, but was he still in the thick of it then, right? Was that post-bankrupt? Where was he?
Had so many bankruptcies, it's hard to keep track. I think there were 6.
Yeah.
But he was still on the ropes from his bankruptcies in Atlantic City. And the Russian mob came to his aid again and again and again in bailing him out. In 2002, you may recall, Felix Sater and his company, Bayrock Group, moved into Trump Tower. They took their offices on the 24th floor, just one or two floors below Trump's personal office. And they started making deals with him. And they said, look, you don't have to put up a dime. We will put up all the funding. You don't have to develop the skyscrapers. We'll do the development. We just want to borrow your name. And for that, we'll give you, I think it was 18 to 25% of the profits on a franchise deal, for which he had to do nothing. So it was an incredibly lucrative deal for Trump. And it happened again and again and again. And these people who ran Bayrock were affiliated with the Russian mafia and or the Russian intelligence. And it goes way, way back.
Yeah, I think as well in the 1990s, he got involved in World Resorts International, which is sort of a murky part of the Trump history, but it also involves a lot of mob figures, if I remember correctly. So there's, as he was emerging from that bankruptcy, he sort of landed on his feet with World Resorts, and then you're right, he sort of developed this very lucrative relationship with Felix, and that's where there was the first discussion of a Trump Tower in Moscow, which of course was the bedrock of a lot of what people thought was going to be the Mueller investigation, was that potential tower in Moscow. So you really are saying here what I suspected might be true, is that Charles McGonagall's career may have started in the 1990s, so the mid 1990s, tracking the Russian mob in New York City. It's almost impossible for him to have missed Donald Trump in that time, because Donald Trump was so intricately involved with the mob at that time.
Right. You have to almost aggressively look the other way. And if you're being paid large sums by Oleg Deripaska, you probably are going to look the other way. I mean, Deripaska is not just another oligarch. He's very, very close to Putin. He controls the aluminum industry, which is a really vital strategic resource. I mean, airplanes are made out of aluminum. So if he owns aluminum factories in Ukraine, well, that means they're sort of at the mercy of a pal of Vladimir Putin's. So the strategic resources are essential. And Deripaska, of all the oligarchs, was always front and center, leading the way for Putin. And he was the guy behind Paul Manafort. I mean, if you go back to, you realize that when Putin first tried to take over Ukraine, he was trying to do it not militarily, but by bribing people through the inside, through taking over inside through soft power. And Deripaska was one of the key weapons he was using.
Absolutely. And Deripaska and Manafort and a guy named Konstantin Kilimnik, who later was, named by the U.S. Treasury Department as an actual Russian spy working for the GRU. They were a team, Kilimnik and Manafort, in Ukraine to try and destabilize the government in Ukraine for Oleg Deripaska. That's really part of the record now. There's no disputing that. So you're right about Deripaska having a long reach in the more recent years, but just staying back a little bit, if we could, on that period of times in the 1990s and before that, James Kallstrom, if I remember correctly, and you might have more information on this than I do, was the guy who used to wiretap all the Cosa Nostra mob dons at the time, because they'd just gotten all this fancy technology which allowed them to wiretap a lot of the dons. And that is one of the reasons the Cosa Nostra sort of started to fall apart, was because of all these successful indictments of them based on these wiretappings. And this, in fact, led to wasn't there a commission around the mob or something like that in the 90s that I think he was involved in as well, that he sort of spearheaded. So, Kallstrom was to a large extent credited with the beginning of the end of the Cosa Nostra's reign in New York, and Rudy Giuliani as well. But really what they were doing was giving cover for the Russians to move in and take over.
Right. The Russian infiltration began, really, I go all the way back to 1980 when you look at Trump's very first commercial success. And it was actually a genuine success. He had very few real successes. But when he built the Hyatt Grand Hotel in 1980. He made a fortune off of it, and he had to buy his TV sets. Like every hotel, it needed hundreds of television sets, and he bought it from a store called the Joy Ludd Electronics Store. And Joy Ludd happened to be a KGB front. And one of the owners was a man named Semyon Kislin, who was close to none other than Rudy Giuliani and remains so until this day, more than 40 years later. And he was one of the very first to approach Trump in selling those TV sets. One of my sources was a former KGB major named Yuri Svitz, and Yuri was telling me that Kislin was known as a spotter agent. He was supposed to spot new assets that the KGB should recruit, and this was his act of bringing Donald Trump into the fold.
Yeah, you could see how Donald Trump would have been an attractive figure for the KGB to groom. I mean, not only was he just so interested in money, that must make him an easy target, an easy mark, but also his outward appearance would have been so appealing to them, the sort of faux glam, this incredible ostentatious lifestyle that would have appealed to the Russians as an easy target. And in fact, he was. I mean, it was back then that he took his first trip to Moscow in the late 1980s, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, Yuri was saying, if you want to recruit someone, want to know, are they easily flattered?
Yeah.
Are they narcissistic? Do they like women? Do they like money?
Yeah.
Trump was
that.
for them.
Yeah, easy mark for them for sure. I just want to underline for people why we're spending so much time talking about this guy that maybe they haven't heard too much about before, Mr. Charles McLaughlin, because McGonagall, I should say. The reason he's made the news, and it's pretty stunning, that an FBI executive, a guy who's in charge of counterintelligence at the biggest office in the FBI, the New York City field office, is indicted not only once but twice on the same day. He was indicted in New York by the SDNY for working for Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska and laundering unknown amount of money, but a certain large amount of money for his work, because Deripaska sanctioned. An FBI officer of his standing, even a retired one, should know that it was a bad form to try and work for Deripaska, and any money that he was receiving would be considered completely illegal, and it would be contravening the sanctions, which is what he was charged with. But at the same time, he was also charged in DC for something that happened while he was still in the FBI, because the Deripaska stuff was only after he retired from the FBI. But while he was at the FBI, he apparently took a $225,000 bribe from an Albanian businessman. And that was to investigate a politician in Albania. And I'll get into all of that in a second. But it had to do with mostly Albanian politics. But what it tells me is that the guy was open to bribery while working in the New York field office as the head of counterintelligence, at the same time that he was investigating people like Oleg Deripaska, at the same time as he was investigating Trump Russia, as he was investigating the biggest attack on American democracy ever. Charles McGonagall was pocketing at least one bribe from this Albanian businessman. You might believe that there's other bribes too, but it's quite stunning to think that he was placed in that position by James Comey at the time, because there must have been suspicions around his loyalty and his integrity.
Absolutely, and it's hard to believe that the $225,000 is the only money that changed hands. If that's what came from Deripaska, it's a small price to pay when you're facing sanctions and.
That came from the Albanian prime minister, and the Deripaska amount, I think it was a fair amount of $40,000 a month that he was getting in his retirement, which is pretty good. Now, what do you get for $40,000 a month? You must have to be, I don't know, he needs to be spending that money on something, presumably on making sure that Deripaska doesn't get into any more trouble, or that sanctions get lifted, or I don't know what he was doing, but certainly Deripaska was still very involved in trying to get his sanctions lifted at the time when that particular bit of action was. But the stuff that irks me the most is in 2016, while we were in the middle of this incredible attack, while we were in the middle of Donald Trump becoming the president of the United States, potentially as a plant for the Russians, here's a guy who's willing to accept large amounts of money from Eastern European countries to do their bidding. That tells me that maybe the investigation into Donald Trump was completely bungled, or if not bungled, never was allowed to really succeed.
Right. No, I think the FBI has completely fallen down on this. I'd love to know what Frank Figliuzzi has to say about it. I know that McGonagall reported to him at some point. And I think he expressed shock at the revelations.
I went and dug up Charles McGonagall's 2016. This is James Comey announcing that he's got a new special agent in charge of counterintelligence, the counterintelligence division for the New York field office. And it says, Director Comey has named Charles McGonagall as the special agent in charge of counterintelligence division for the New York field office. McGonagall most recently served as the section chief of the Cyber Counterintelligence Coordination Section at FBI headquarters. Mr. McGonagall entered on duty with the FBI in 1996. He was first assigned to the New York field office, where he worked Russian foreign counterintelligence and organized crime matters. During his tenure in New York, Mr. McGonagall worked on the TWA Flight 800 investigation and was also assigned to the task force investigating the Wen-Ho Lee investigation. So we can go into that one in a bit. He also investigated the 1998 terrorist bombings in the U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, and investigated the September 11th terror attacks. Now, that's a list of bold headlines, big investigations, all of which were kind of unsatisfactory in their speed of resolution, but also in being able to resolve them. And TWA 800, we still don't know what happened to TWA 800. It disappeared out of the sky. Most people think it was hit by something, but the official reason, I still think, is that it had a malfunction of its fuel cell or something like that.
Right, and with the events of 9/11, what happened just after 9/11 was extraordinarily astonishing to me, which is, if you remember, American skies were completely shut down. There was no air traffic whatsoever. Mm-hmm. But the only planes allowed to fly during those 2 days, September 11th to September 13th, were planes carrying the bin Laden family and members of the Royal House of Saud. And I wrote about this in House of Bush, House of Saud. But, the FBI should have been interrogating these people.
Well, now we know, yeah, for sure. Now we know that they really were very involved. The documents that were recently released by the Biden White House certainly point in that direction. And if I remember correctly, the bin Laden, not the bin Laden family, but the royal family, were at least a representative of theirs was at the White House the day after the 9/11 attacks. With George Bush.
Was meeting with President Bush on the 13th, and clearly they got a waiver from the White House to let these planes fly. So once again, you see connections between the powers that be and the people who actually did one of the greatest terrorist acts in American history.
Yeah, you're so correct in pointing that out. All of these are amongst, when I think about my career in news, certainly TWA and these embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya, these were bold, big terror attacks that really captivated the attention of the world as the earlier of the terror attacks, sort of not the ones that killed 3,000 people like September 11th, but certainly it captured the imagination of what terror could mean to the United States and what a terrorist mindset could mean to America. And really, the world hasn't gotten any better since they started with those. We've had a constant escalation of these terror attacks. Our security posture has gotten worse and worse and worse throughout all these years. We sort of have been under these kind of terror attacks since the early 90s, and it's been consistent since then. So, to have this guy, McGonagall, involved in every single one of these key investigations, And then to see now that he is open to bribery and corruption on a scale which is quite large, makes you question whether the FBI has been doing the right kind of work all along in counterintelligence, especially in the New York office.
Right. And as I said before, I mean, I think the fact that he was in counterintelligence is extraordinary, because when you look at the Mueller investigation, you realize they concentrated only on crimes, not on national security threats, as a counterintelligence investigation should do. So to me, it seems clear that if Trump has laundered tens of millions of dollars for the Russian mafia, which after all is connected to Russian intelligence, and if he was bailed out again and again by Bayrock and other actors that were tied to Russia, the Russian Federation, isn't he compromised? They own him.
Yeah, they own him. But I guess if you have a cop in your pocket who's running the counterintelligence office at the FBI, and you have someone like Rod Rosenstein at the Department of Justice who's going to give you a very limited briefing around Mueller, you're feeling pretty, confident that you're not going to get caught, because the FBI counterintelligence guy is giving you all the information about what's going on. And if Mueller and his special investigators were doing anything outside of the borders of just investigating the narrow Trump-Russia mandate that Rod Rosenstein gave them, it becomes very, no wonder they were able to feel so confident, and no wonder Trump was able to say things as outrageously as he did about, he can go shoot people on Fifth Avenue and not be arrested, because probably the truth of it is they owned the cops, and they owned what investigation might be coming down the line at them. Plus, owned the mob in New York.
Yes, no, it's just extraordinary. And I think what we see again and again is we have so little oversight in this country. Now with the Republicans taking over Congress, it's just a joke. They're going to be doing everything McGonagall did all over again.
Yeah.
And not really doing anything to protect us.
Yeah, I don't think there's any actual ruling or government going on right now. Now there's just like vengeance attacks to set up another, really tough election for 2024. That seems to me what they're up to. There's one interesting case that I had to look up today because I didn't know anything about it. Was Wen-Ho Lee, which is really the case of the Los Alamos nuclear secrets. And Wen-Ho Lee was a scientist there who was wrongly accused of giving the Chinese plans to this nuclear weapon that the United States had developed. And there was a rush to judgment there. He spent a fair amount of time in confinement as they were trying to find ways to charge him. There was a very interesting 60 Minutes report on him, and I'll just play a short minute from that because I think it'll give us a sense of the players involved and the hysteria around what was going on at Los Alamos and the loss of these nuclear secrets.
Even though he's never been charged with a crime, Dr. Lee was fired from his job in the top secret Division X at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. He's been portrayed in newspapers across the country as a traitor. And the truth is...
The truth is I'm innocent. I have not done anything wrong with the...
Did you at any time pass any information, any U.S. nuclear secrets to the People's Republic of China?
No, I never have done that, and I have no intention doing that at all, period.
Bill Richardson personally fired Wen-Ho Lee.
That we dismissed an employee who was not following proper security procedures at the lab, who is under suspicion for security breaches.
Even though he's never been charged with a crime.
So, I mean, it's
Dr.
just
Lee
interesting
was
to see
fired
that
from his
60
job
Minutes report
in the
because...
top secret
just get this off
division.
here. Firstly, we know what really happened at Los Alamos now. We know that Robert Maxwell was able to get a promised software snuck into the software systems of Los Alamos, and that is how they were able to siphon the nuclear secrets out of there for China. That it wasn't, in fact, this poor guy who ended up, losing his career and spending a lot of time in confinement. But it's also interesting that we see Richardson there, who, for still in a lot of people's mind, mine included, is very aligned to Jeffrey Epstein. So you've got two characters there who are suffering, and one side suffering, the other side inflicting the suffering. but both related to sort of this Maxwell Epstein dynasty that was set up during that time. And it reminds me of how prominent and powerful the Maxwell Epstein crime machine really was. I mean, that they were able to not only infiltrate Los Alamos, get all these secrets out, the most secure place in America, unnoticed, and then also was able to practically frame this poor guy, Wen Ho Lee, who was then, framed for this. And until today, I don't think there's an official record that the Maxwell promise thing was how these secrets went out and how we lost those secrets. And so we still don't really know what happened with Epstein either. But it seems to me that there's a criminal machine there that has never quite been brought to justice and has never quite been explained to anyone's satisfaction. And I know you wrote about Epstein as well in An American Compromise, so you must have some thinking about that.
Well, there's just too much corruption, is the honest truth. You can't answer every single question. I've given up on that. But I do think if you go back really to the 70s, and when there were crackdowns on the CIA, for example, by the Church Committee, what grew out of that was a lot of people in the CIA, also in Israeli intelligence, started doing off-the-books operations. And there was a lot of illegal arms sales to Iran going on then. There were rogue operatives everywhere selling weapons and doing off-the-books operations. And this is part of it. And Maxwell was a key figure in all of that, and Epstein worked with him.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it that's a church commission, which they're trying to duplicate now, by the way, which is kind of amazing that's their reference, because it was so, the results of it was so horrific. But the church commission did land up clipping the wings of American intelligence operations around the world. And what happened there was they started, basically assigning all these black ops to all these supposedly allied nations like Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE. And I guess I'll just speak bluntly about this. If your allies are out there committing crimes supposedly in your name, maybe then you need to have people in the FBI office who are not exposing those crimes, because you might know that those crimes are happening. So does that make any sense, that idea that maybe McGonagall and Free and Kallstrom and Rudy were in a way covering up for operations that were being carried out perhaps in the name, or at least by the allies of the CIA and America?
Well, certainly Rudy. I mean, if you look at Donald Trump's first impeachment, and essentially you see going back 15 years, Paul Manafort, who became Trump's campaign manager, was essentially an operative for Deripaska and other oligarchs in Ukraine, and for a Putin puppet named Yanukovych. And when after that, Putin tried other tactics, and Trump was withholding. When Zelensky got fairly elected, Trump began withholding weapons from them, and that's what led to the first impeachment. Mm-hmm. And clearly, he was functioning on behalf of Vladimir Putin.
100%. I think that's absolutely true. And well, it's kind of shocking he wasn't really removed from government after that impeachment. Let me tell you a little bit more, if I may, about Mr. McGonagall's dealings in Albania, because they are really fascinating. There's a bunch of characters you see on the screen. I'll explain who each of them are. The Prime Minister of Albania, the current Prime Minister of Albania, is Edi Rama. Pretty well-known guy. He's an autocrat, but there's no other way really to describe him, although he's an autocrat in a democracy. So he rules with an iron fist, but the opposition party, mostly the Democratic Party in Albania, still gets 42% of the vote. So they're still a very powerful body. In fact, the reason that the $225,000 was sent to, or given to Charles McGonagall by his friend, Agron Neza, who's a former Albanian intelligence agent and close to Edi Rama, was because what they were trying to do in the United States was to get the FBI to launch an investigation into a lobbyist hired by the prime minister's opposition. So the opposition party in Albania is called the Democratic Party. They had hired a lobbyist in the United States to do some work on their behalf. In order to discredit that lobbyist, Edi Rama paid $225,000 to Charles McGonagall to get an investigation going into that lobbyist. In fact, there was an investigation, and the guy was cleared. This was while he was in charge of the counterintelligence office at the FBI. So the guy on the top there is the former energy minister, or the deputy energy minister, Dorian Duca, and a close friend of Edi Rama. And so this is where the indictment in DC takes us, down this road of bribery of, almost $250,000 that goes from the prime minister ostensibly, but really from his friend Agro Neza to Charles McGonagall in order to dirty up the Albanian opposition. Now they're obviously up in arms about all of this in Albania right now, and they're calling for Mr. Rama's resignation. None of it's going to happen probably, but it's certainly interesting that American politics or American crime investigations are having the potential of overthrowing a government in Albania right on Putin's doorstep. It's also worth mentioning that Mr. Rama is close to Mr. Putin, as one has to be. I think if you're running a government in that part of the world, Albania, right near the border of Russia, you'd have to certainly be friendly with the Russians. But up until now, they've been mostly Western focused and Western facing since they got independence in 1991. However, the history of Mr. McGonagall goes back, and Albania goes back even further to 2008. This is when something really weird happened. In 2008, Charles McGonagall, along with his friend Angro Neza, who we just saw from the previous slide, a friend of the prime minister, started a company called the Law Office and Investigation Office. It's a company in Albania. In fact, they didn't start it. They bought 75% of that company from a guy named Shefket Dizdari. Shefket Dizdari is a prominent lawyer in that part of the world, and also the owner of an oil company that was involved in bidding for some oil mines or oil fields that they have, up for auction, as they do in some countries every year or so. And the fourth partner in this company was Mark Thomas Rossini, another former FBI agent who has been previously charged for trying to bribe a government official in Puerto Rico. You've got two former FBI guys involved in this company, and this is the first that the American public is hearing of it. I've not heard this reported in the United States, but here's the actual paperwork where we can see that these four are in partnership together since 2009, and it's the law and investigation firm. Why it's now being thought of as being significant is that same law and let me show you those documents. I don't think you got to see them. The law and investigation office that they had started, and this company they had started, plus the $225,000 that had been invested or given to Mr. McGonagall, actually had a purpose. They were going to be paying for oil concessions that the Albanian government was putting up for auction. So just to explain the concessions a little bit, Mr. Rama's government, I'll pull up Mr. Rama again, had already had a bid out to a bunch of to auction a bunch of oil fields. They had already given it to somebody prominent, but then that someone prominent was discovered to have ties to Russia, so they canceled that bid, and then they did another auction. That other auction ultimately landed up giving the oil auction that they were bidding on to Mr. Shefket Dizdari, because it was his company, Transoil, that landed up winning the bid for this particular oil field. So one assumes Charles McGonagall would have benefited from that, Agro Neza would have benefited from that, and Mark Thomas Rossini, as partners in one of these firms, would have all benefited from this purchase of these oil fields. And here comes the kicker, and it really explains Albanian politics to you quite a lot, is that even though the first oil bid landed up being tied to the Russians, it turns out that even this oil bid, which supposedly was the clean one, with Mr. Shefket Dizdari, was also tied to the Russians, that he had a close relationship with Gazprom and that intended to work with Gazprom all along. And, it just reminds me, and I think it is an important reminder for all of us to keep in mind, especially as we think about how Russia works in their disinformation efforts and in their destabilization efforts. They work both sides of the spectrum a lot. They have no problem that they'll have one bid, they'll work with one guy, but then they'll work with the other guy. They want to control the field and they want to control chaos. It's not so much ideological as it is, to just try and get as much chaos on the ground as possible. But nevertheless, we have a case here where two ex-FBI agents, one who's just been charged with these two indictments involving bribery and corruption, was also likely involved in an Albanian purchase or an attempted purchase of this oil field that involved Gazprom. And that's where the story is going to go. I think that this is, it seems like a fairly confined story to just Deripaska and company, is actually much bigger, because here he is actually working directly with, maybe not unknowingly, but still working directly with Gazprom, which is like basically working for the Kremlin, as you know. So that's a part of the story that has not yet quite been revealed by the American media, and I'm not sure why, but it's certainly the next steps of this that is going to, be quite shocking when you think about the guy from the FBI who was investigating Trump Russia, working a business deal in Albania with Gazprom. I mean, that's stunning, right?
Right. No, I mean, there are far too many ties between the FBI and Putin's people. I mean, and whether it's from William Sessions to Louis Freeh to McGonagall and many more. There are just too many. Rudy Giuliani. It's ridiculous.
It seems to me that the whatever monitoring they do, where they expect the former agents to come clean on whatever it is they're doing once they leave the office and declare all their international dealings, is not working. And what they really need to do is make it illegal to work for. I know it's tough for a lot of these FBI agents who might have to leave and retire early, but we can't have former FBI agents running around the world working for our adversaries once they leave office. I mean, it's almost too enticing a thing for them to get this payout at the end of their career, and go and do this dirty work for Russia or whomever else.
Right, and think of it from the point of view of an FBI agent who's out in the field and he sees that his former boss, William Sessions, is now making a fortune representing Semyon Mogilevich, or as Louis Freeh is doing with Prevezan. These are the people the FBI was investigating. Mogilevich was on the 10 most wanted list, and now they're defending the lawsuits defending him. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense, and it's hard to imagine a world where you're like someone like Louis Freeh is not calling up the investigators involved in each of these investigations and either providing direction or comment or whatever. I mean, it's just shouldn't be allowed that you can do that. And you mentioned Sessions. I mean, I think that there's, of all of them, the most shocking and egregious thing is that William Sessions left the FBI and then went to work for the world's number one mobster. It's corruption on a level that really is hard to fathom, and it's a major weakness in the American law and order system.
Right. It's amazing to me the way the bar has gotten lower and lower and lower as I've aged. When I was very, very young, I mean, goes back to the Eisenhower era, but President Eisenhower's chief of staff, Sherman Adams, had received a very nice overcoat as a gift, a Vicuna overcoat. And there was so much protest against it. He got it from a lobbyist, and this was seen as pay for play. And I don't know what a fancy overcoat costs these days, but I can't imagine it's more than a few $1,000s. And yet today you see someone like Jared Kushner getting $2 billion, and everyone just says, ho hum.
Yeah, right? It's amazing. It's amazing that the lucrative side of politics and the thing that makes it attractive for people to come into politics now is the ability to use power and money to subvert the system. It's much more enticing than the other side of it, which is go and help your fellow man and come up with some good governing policies. It's
a scandal if a congressman became, say, an oil lobbyist or went into which happens all the time, of course. But now we see, even in the FBI, the sacred FBI, that they're actually working for the bad guys.
Yeah, it's really interesting. This Thomas Rossini guy that we just showed you, the other FBI agents involved in this deal around the Albanian oil fields. I found this clip of his on Albanian TV. Here he is talking about the oil bid that failed, but he's also talking about a tweet that he sent out, which helped, frame the Democratic Party opponents of the existing government in Albania. So he sent out this tweet. Let me just find it for you, which said, "Oh, now I can't read it." Said, Albania, think about it. Albania is the last country on the Adriatic to join the EU, which is the goal of Merkel and Rama, and what all Albanians want. Putin wants to destroy the EU, and Albania and EU denies his warm water port. Why is Berisha, the Democratic Party leader, Putin's puppet? Now, of course, Berisha is not Putin's puppet. This is an FBI guy getting paid by Russia to put out this disinformation on Twitter. And then he goes on television, on Albanian TV, and has this to say, which, this is an FBI, a former FBI, American FBI officer.
By staging those protests at this point in time, okay, he's playing into Putin's hands. That's why he's a puppet, whether he knows it or not. That was my whole point of my emotional tweet. Stop. Think first what this means in the overall big picture. That's what's most important. Think about the long-term effects and ramifications of that. Not just your short-term goal of you want Mr. Rama out and you want to be prime minister, or you want Mr. Bashir to be prime minister. If there's something wrong with Eddie Rama, if there's change that's needed, fine. But now is not the time. You are being a puppet of Putin. It plays into his hands by having that protest now.
So, you've basically got an FBI agent, former FBI officer, doing Putin's disinformation work in a foreign country. It's appalling. And all for these concessions, that he was trying to get, these oil concessions that they ultimately got from Gazprom, with Gazprom. It's the ultimate amount of cheek when you think about the work that these guys were meant to be doing.
It's also a very similar paradigm to the whole Hunter Biden case and the impeachment, because there again, you have them. Biden was actually trying to help root out corruption in Ukraine, and when he was vice president, and it happened. His son was working for Burisma, and it really should have been investigated, but the Ukraine had a corrupt Putin puppet as an attorney general, and Biden was putting pressure on him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I think the Hunter Biden case. There's a lot still to be uncovered there. It certainly deserves a real investigation. I don't think we can get one out of the Congress, but it certainly deserves some answers and some serious oversight. Tell us a little bit more about this brilliant book that you wrote, American Compromise. Tell people about what they can expect if they really want to read it, and why it's such a good read.
Well, I'd like to go back to the beginning and see how all of this started. So. I go back all the way to 1980. And again, this was Donald Trump's, he was just becoming a superstar. His very first major development, the Grand Hyatt Hotel right next to Grand Central Station, they needed, like every hotel, they needed TV sets. And somehow or other, he ended up buying them from a man named Semyon Kislin, who I'm told was a spotter agent for the KGB. And when Trump started meeting with him and bought those TV sets, he was being seen as an asset, and that was the door opening. And after that, Trump met several times with a woman, Dubinina, the daughter of the ambassador, first to the United Nations and then to the UN. And she was started flattering Trump and saying, why don't you build a Trump Tower in Moscow? That would be great. And that was what they started dangling in front of him. It was the KGB that actually drew up plans and sent Trump to Moscow in 1987. It was done by the KGB according to my source, Yuri Svitz, who was in the KGB, was major in the KGB back then.
Yeah, Yuri and you were on the show actually a year or so ago when you first came out, and that's a riveting conversation. Yuri's take is so fascinating, and then you talk a lot about there's the house in I'm blanking out now in Miami. I can't remember his name now. I imagine that. Rybolovlev, yeah. Right? I got it right. That house, the sale that Trump and Epstein battled over, and that Trump ultimately, was overpaid for, and that was a way to get him out of.
And then Rybolovlev doubled it again.
Yeah, and that's how he got out of bankruptcy back then. I mean, this was an operation to cultivate an asset, and you paint a very gripping picture in this book about how they did it. It's a fantastic read. Everyone should really read it, especially considering that this man is even considering another run. It would be shocking if he achieved it. But right now, he remains the leading candidate out of all the Republicans by 17 points in the latest poll. He may just yet be the next president of the United States. I can't believe that I'm even uttering those words, but it may happen. Craig, it's so good to see you, and thank you very much for spending the hour with us. Always fantastic getting your insight into all of this and learning so much from you. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Zev. I appreciate it.
That's Craig Unger, the author of American Compromat. And that's all the show we have for you tonight. Don't forget, you can always help us out by going to patreon.com/narrative and becoming a patron. You'll get exclusive content there, and you also get to know that you're supporting the truth, which is always nice to have in your journalism. Have a good night, everyone. We'll see you next Wednesday. Have a good night. Every minute of Narrative's reporting, every story that we break is made possible by our patrons. You too can become a patron by joining at patreon.com/narrative.
Narrative, where truth lives.